the floor. They climb up and down rails, pick up these bins. The bins have product, they take them to a picker. This is a particularly exciting thing because they not only retrieve the product, but when the product is diminished, they take the bin to a place for replenishment and take care of that. We're also experiencing this in our everyday lives. This is a video from Sam's that you download an app to your phone, you scan all the items that you want, you pay for the items using the phone, and then you walk past the cashier's lanes right to the front door, man greets you, make sure that you have the items, and you're on your way. Again, no cashiers. Amazon in their Go stores is promoting this, saying they have no lines, no checkouts. You go in, scan, and you leave. McDonald's, this is another example here, where instead of going to a cashier, you go to a kiosk and you order the items that you want. This is an exciting thing too. This is autonomous vehicles, which seem to be so space age. This is a vehicle that traveled between Colorado Springs and Denver, about 125 miles. You see the gentleman hits a button and climbs into the sleeper. And this was a delivery of beer to a retailer. He remained in the sleeper until he got to the point of where they needed to back it up, and he backed it up into the plant. But you know, obviously these are things that are ongoing. There are many other options, many other examples of this. But let's talk about some of these professions. In the terms of cashier, according to the Bureau of Labor Standards, there are 3.5 million people who are employed as cashiers in the United States. Let's talk about warehouses. There's 3.9 million people who are employed in warehouses. You know, 1.8 million who are employed as fabricators or assemblers. All of these are repetitive jobs which are capable and certainly will be automated, and that, as you've seen in the video clips that I showed. Let's talk about autonomous driving. The Obama administration in December of 2016, on their way out, compiled a report. It was Artificial Intelligence, Automation, and the Economy. The Council of Economic Advisors, and one of the things they examined was the question of autonomous vehicles. And they estimated between 2.2 and 3.1 million people are involved part-time or full-time in driving, delivery, that sort of thing. This didn't take into account the 364,000 jobs that are held by people who work for Uber and for Lyft. But they said that these jobs, the 2.2 to 3.1 million individuals, were capable of being automated. Now, a lot of people I know say, oh, this can't be. I would never drive in an autonomous vehicle. A robot's not going to drive my car, and I don't want to be on a road with a robot driving. But let me point out this. There's nearly 5 million accidents every year in the United States amongst vehicles. Of those, they result in about 40,000 traffic fatalities, okay? The truck that we just saw, the beer truck, had technology that senses different points, 1.3 million different pieces of information every second. Also, they're capable of communicating back and forth between different vehicles. So I think it becomes eventually a process of liability that is simply too unsafe for a truck driver, for instance, to continue driving.
1 second.
Sure, I don't think you're on.
Hang on. How you turn this? Is it at the bottom here? All right. I have a loud voice. So, hey there. Oh, there it is. Boy, now it sounds weird. And I want to point out, I've actually been to a number of meetings. So you have the issue of safety, which is absolutely true. But the trucking companies in particular, they do the thing called platooning, where they're not going to just have one of these. They're going to have multiple trucks in a row that is sequenced to a certain distance between the trucks. And that's going to maximize the airflow and the resistance that the trucks have on highways. So they're going to maximize the distance between the trucks. The design of the truck, of course, is going to be influential as well. But they're going to be controlling these things and having several of them working together. And there's going to be a function that where they will platoon, they call it. So they're working together in concert. So when you're transporting a lot of goods across the highway system, you're going to be doing this. So there's the safety issue. And now there's the issue that you won't need as many truck drivers. And you'll be able to keep them actually within closer proximity to each other so that you can get gas mileage, better fuel efficiency, and all of those kind of things as well. So it's going to become both the safety, and it's going to save the companies money. It's going to save transportation goods money. It's going to mean that Sam's Club or Costco or whatever the other big box stores are going to have goods cheaper. So it's an amazing thing. It's coming, and actually we're doing some testing in Columbus, I believe, on some trucks and platooning in certain sections of Columbus. And actually the governor, Governor Kasich, is trying to do a lot of high-end technology stuff with some of these autonomous vehicles and using Columbus as sort of a testing ground. But they're actually already on. The video did a good job of showing it, but it's out there, and they're looking right now. I've seen the people are trying to get the policy ready so that they can do this. The insurance companies are coming out to make sure they have all the right insurance stuff here. So it's so obvious that this is going to happen that all the ancillary pieces of the puzzle are coming into work right now. You wouldn't have insurance people going to conferences talking about what is the legislation supposed to look like to make sure we take care of things. They are, which means it is definitely coming down the pike. So I just wanted to kind of tack that on
absolutely.
to show how real and how surprisingly quick this thing can happen, and sort of the nature. So those truck drivers, unfortunately, because it's an amazing thing, because those are a lot of good paying jobs too. They're going to become sort of like the new manufacturing.
And often truck driving is one of the largest industries in a particular state. So it really has a dramatic impact. I've read also reports similar to what you're describing. They also talk about the fact that these things, they may not run at 65 miles or 60 miles an hour. They continuously go, say, at 45. They're easy to pass, but they run 24 hours a day without rest, no rest requirements from the DOT or anything like that. So it's really quite a challenge, actually. And it does have the potential, probably the probability of displacing a lot of these really good jobs, high-paying jobs.
Then think about what happens to the pilot stations and the Truckers America and the jobs of the people who work at those, and all the food stuff and the vending stuff and the coffee stuff, because you'll have less, truck traffic. So, I mean, those whole things are sprouted up across the country because there's that constant demand for the people going across the country. So, I mean, that's where the ripple effect starts to hit.
Exactly. Yeah, there's the ripple effect is a good way of describing that. As I mentioned, the Obama administration came out with a report in 2016, and they noted in that report that that this autonomous or new economy has the potential for displacing millions of Americans. There's a consulting company, this McKinsey & Company, that indicated that 60% of all occupations see at least 30% or more of the functions of that occupation automated with today's technology. And one of the big granddaddies, one of the most cited examples or reports in this field of literature is this study that came from the Oxford Martin School, the business school, Oxford University, The Future of Employment. And this is an interesting report because it directly applies to the United States. They took data from the Bureau of Labor Standards, and they analyzed the various job functions that were described within there. And they found that up to 47% of the jobs that currently exist that were categorized, they did a study of 702 jobs. 47% of jobs in the United States are capable of automation. The Columbus Dispatch, I think you might have had a comment about this, had just recently reported on that, saying that upwards of 50% of the jobs in Ohio indeed could be automated.
And I think this is where I kind of wanted to jump in and talk a lot about that where does this tie down to make it real on the ground, rubber meeting the road, so to speak, in Ohio. And I was looking, and what's amazing is you look at the Midwest, and Ohio is certainly at the heart of that. And if you think about all the things that we hear about with Ohio, the lack of job creation, the less people in the labor force, and that's actually even more important now than the unemployment rate, because we hear a lot about how great our unemployment rate is in Ohio. It's a little misleading, because if somebody stops looking for a job, they aren't technically counted in the unemployment rate. So there's a separate number called the labor force, which basically means people who identify as working or seeking work. So those that are out of work but are seeking work are what is the delta that creates the unemployment rate. But when people drop out completely of the labor force, and Ohio has just suffered as much, or maybe more than really hardly any other state, maybe West Virginia as well, but really this Midwestern phenomenon. And when you look at what this means, it has meant particularly an incredible decline of men employment and the employment and it's creating a lot of ancillary problems. So this has already happened. Manufacturing, for example, I was looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's a fascinating thing. We all know it, we see it. But Ohio had over 1 million manufacturing jobs as recently as the dawn of the 21st century, so in 2000. By 2010, we were down to about 614,000. We've rebounded, and according to the latest statistics, we're in the upper 680s. So we've gained, or I'm sorry, 690. So we're about 700,000 manufacturing jobs. Think about that though. We're still 300,000 net manufacturing jobs down in Ohio today from where we were at the beginning of the 21st century. And a lot of those jobs are equally going to have some of the same phenomena that we were talking about earlier. There's going to be impacted those are the good paying jobs. It doesn't take a lot to see where some of that stress, that conflict, you have the people who have identity that gets wrapped up in their employment, what happens, frustration. We have, it ties into some of the things that you've heard about, I know, here in some of the previous lessons on the opioid addiction issues and problems that start emerging that way. It is a massive problem in Ohio. And so for all the opportunities that are here, this does showcase that dark underside to what happens to folks. And I think you have some slides to talk about some of the type of people, and I'll let you go to that. But for Ohio alone, if you just think about those numbers by themselves, and the jobs that are actually being created now are mostly in hospitality and education. And I'm not to say anything negative about those jobs. I'm glad that those jobs are being created. And some of those jobs may actually be slightly, for a while, less susceptible potentially to some of this. But there's a cost to that too, right? A lot of those jobs don't have the same kind of income. So the problems that we have in Ohio that we are trying to see turned around, they're pretty endemic. They're pretty baked into the cake at the moment. And we are struggling mightily in Ohio to do it. So this, the bad side of this, and I don't want to be, call them Luddites, which are the people who used to break machines back at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. I don't want to be a new age Luddite who wants to say the technology is bad. But we have to wrestle with the reality that there is going to be a massive dislocation, and Ohio is going to be front and center. It already is, and it's going to continue to be, of what happens and the societal challenges to that. What do we do to connect people and do that? So I'll stop now.
No, that's a good segue. And just to kind of give us a sense for this, again, that Oxford Martin School of Business study had talked about within the next 10 to 15 years, elimination of 47% of jobs. And that's an interesting figure. And I thought, at least to give it some context and to kind of piggyback on what Greg's talking about, if we're talking about 47% of jobs, well, roughly right now we have about 126 million people who are employed. If we were to replace all of those, if 47% of those people are impacted, that's roughly 59 million people who are either displaced or their jobs are diminished, and assumably their pay is diminished because of the implementation of automation and artificial intelligence. And again, I would like to say I'm not a neo-Luddite. I do not want to smash machinery. I want to embrace it. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about a tremendous impact. And these figures, the 47% figure, is contingent upon today's technology, which is constantly increasing in its efficacy and adaptability. So in the future, with improved software, processor power, and algorithms, more and more jobs will be impacted. I'll just give you a quick example of that. They're not all low-skilled jobs. Radiologists are in danger, actually, of being automated and losing their job, because IBM has produced an artificial intelligence called Watson, and they've adapted it to read MRIs and other type of radiographic films. And what they're finding is that it is a great benefit because they're more efficient. They don't get, Watson doesn't get tired. It's more efficient. But they've also found that it's actually very, very exacting in picking out cancers and other malignancies early on, much more so than a human would be able to do so. So it's not just truck drivers, it's not cashiers, it's a broader range. And I think if you come away with anything, we'd like to suggest policies. We'd like to be able to to describe all of this, but the impacts are just beginning to be felt, and we're seeing more and more as the technologies apply, we're seeing more and more areas impacted. So you had mentioned, Greg had mentioned who would be actually impacted. And initially, it will indeed be the lower skilled folks in the middle class and the working poor. This is, again, from the Council of Economic Advisors. And they talked about some of the facts, some of the figures are tremendous. 42% of all workers in the United States earn $15 or less. 83% of jobs making under $20 were discovered to be highly automatable. 31% of jobs making between $20 and $40 would be automatable. 44% of Americans workers with less than a high school degree hold jobs that are in the area that would be classified as highly automatable. And there is a distinction between low skill in education, lower education, and high skill, higher education, in which the study found that 4% of jobs making $40 or more, assumably more high skilled individuals, would be capable of being automated. That may change, but having higher skills and more education is certainly a good insulator from this oncoming change in automation. The one thing that's really, really important to recognize as well is that this isn't just happening in the United States. This is happening worldwide. The World Bank has been particularly interested in this and pumping out reports. And what they've done is, now this is a study of jobs in various countries, again, capable of automation. If you notice here, China and India, China is purportedly contains 77% of jobs that could be automated, India 69%. And that makes sense because, again, a lot of these are developing economies where they're highly dependent upon repetitive motion and so forth. And they would be, again, highly susceptible to automation. The World Bank president, Jim Kim, if I can get this down there, oops, one too far. I apologize. There we go, thank you. The World Bank president, Jim Kim, recently noted that automation actually is disrupting the development patterns of developing countries. He stated that the traditional economic path from increasing productivity of agriculture to light manufacturing and then to full-scale industrialization may not be possible for all developing countries because of the advent of automation. So there will have to be adaptations as to how to bring countries along, how to develop countries along in light of the fact that automation would displace large numbers of individuals. So why is this different? We've talked about the Luddites and the fact that they went out in the late 1800s and destroyed machinery so that they wouldn't be replaced. And in this case, I believe they were textile workers.
They were.
Yeah. Why is it different from today? Well, in the 1870s, nearly 50% of individuals were directly involved in agriculture. Today, because of the technology and implementation of technology, less than 2% of people are involved in agricultural pursuits. But we have a superabundance of food. We have a surplus. Why is that? Well, displaced farm workers were more able to make that jump to a manufacturing economy because it didn't require the skills. I mean, you could go from being a reaper to a guy who put an axle or a nut on an axle. Today's new jobs, this new technology, is causing job disruptions that are much faster. And to make that jump to the new economy, to this automated economy, you need a much more intensive skill set. And low-skill Americans will, making this transition to the high-skill economy, will necessarily require time. They'll have training and retraining. And of course, they'll require support, maybe in the terms of unemployment insurance and so forth. And that's all money. I mean, that's lots and lots of money. I think this is an interesting chart, and it kind of demonstrates what's happening in our economy. And you may criticize me on this, but if you take a look here, between 1948 and 1973, as productivity, as the ability of factories to produce more and more efficiently increased, the wages of employees kind of tracked that pretty much, almost exactly. So as productivity increased, the importance of workers and their labor that they brought to the factory was recognized in terms of their compensation. In 1973, we begin to see the implementation of globalization and also the implementation of technology and automation. And what's happened is productivity has continued to rise. You can see here, but there's been a decoupling right here and now forward where labor, the value of labor isn't as necessary to the increasing productivity of these manufacturing facilities.
I'm going to, just before you switch, if I
Sure.
could just jump in, I think what's interesting about this too is that if you think about manufacturing, the output, I talked about all the numbers of people who are, many fewer folks are now employed in the manufacturing sector here in Ohio alone. But if you think about the output, which is basically what productivity does, it means that you are able to make more stuff with the same amount of inputs. So the issue is we have less people being employed, but we're actually putting more out there. We're actually putting more output in GDP, our state GDP, and being able to export stuff and things like that than we were even with a larger number of people here employed. And so that's what you would expect, but that's the challenge, right, is the fact that you really are, and it's sort of an aphorism to say do more with less, but we literally are doing way more with substantially less. And that is certainly it's going to continue to be that kind of a significant problem. And I think I'm going to get to some of the philosophical stuff probably as we get to the end, but I want to reiterate the point that he made regarding capital and labor. Those are two very important, obviously, pieces of economic theory, and what means capital is the equipment, the machine, or technology that helps to create stuff. And of course, labor is the effort that people put in. And I just want you to think about a person who was actually a German, had a very big beard, who was known as with the name KM or Karl Marx. And you need to, I'm going to come back to this a little later, but I think this is a key thing to think about, is what happens to labor and what happens to capital and what happens in the actual theory of Marxism. Because I think that's a fascinating situation and maybe a little bit scary situation as we continue to see some of this technology continue to explode.
Yeah, and to what you're saying as well, if you look at the chart, oops, I'm sorry, excuse me. If you look to the chart, we're looking at, there's an aggregation of wealth somewhere. And if we're not making it down here, where is that going? And what kind of disruptions is that causing in our economy? This is another quick chart too. It just illustrates more with less. This is a chart of the labor participation rate from the Federal Reserve. You can see in 2008, we had about a 67% or 66% labor participation rate. That's folks who are, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's folks who are either in the economy or actively seeking work. Okay, 16 years or older, okay? Now, 2008, of course, we had the big economic downturn, but we had a, steadily, if not a slow, but a steady improving economy. But if you notice here, it's a precipitous decline, and it's kind of leveled out here over the last couple of years, the last 3 or 4 years. It's not increasing much either. And again, back to the previous chart about productivity, we have increasing productivity, but we have a declining rate or a stagnant rate of labor participation. And it's significant, it truly is. And again, talking about the economic imbalance, we have a quote here from Plutarch: an imbalance between the rich and poor is the oldest and most failing element of all republics. What we have is a divergence between who can and can't participate in the economy, and that becomes a real societal problem. Without a strong middle class, we have a weaker economy. Ours is a consumer-based economy. If you're uneasy about your situation in the future, or you've lost your job, well, we can't continue the consumer-based economy. And the other thing too that you should consider is that if we have fewer and fewer people participating in the economy. We have fewer people giving us their creativity and their ingenuity that drive new developments and new ways of proceeding. And that's really significant. And I have a final quote here from Voltaire, that work keeps at bay 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and need. And this really is central to the debate here. You like that? Okay. So where do we stand? I'd like to start addressing some of the solutions that we have, but I think we have to be realistic about where we stand financially as the federal government, looking to the federal government for assistance. The national debt, as we're all aware, is now almost $21 trillion. And you can see that, it's been, again, a precipitous increase from about 2000 on upwards. And unfortunately, it's not projected to go much lower. If not, it's going to go increasingly higher.
There's definitely nothing like that. And actually, I think that number actually is way underselling actually the real debt, because I don't know that actually includes, I believe, all the Social Security and Medicare and the entitlement spending. I think it's actually, if you actually factor in what they call the entitlement spending programs,
right?
And these are mandatory programs where Congress actually doesn't appropriate it on a yearly basis. It's kind of arcane stuff on one hand, but it's basically on autopilot spending, absent a policy modification by Congress. I think it's closer to $80-something trillion in unfunded long-term liabilities as you're paying this out. So the long-term tail of all the spending is radically worse actually there. Now, the one semi-bright spot is some of this debt, or a good chunk of this debt, is actually held by Americans. So there is foreign, like China owns some of our debt, Japan owns debt. There are foreign countries that own debt, and there's issues associated with that. The good news is we own some of our own debt, but it's still debt. And the problem is that debt, and I think you have a slide on the interest and all that stuff, right? Yeah, okay. I'll let you do that piece. Because, okay, good.
But one thing I do want to point out, and perhaps you can elaborate on this, there's the national debt and then there's total debt.
Yes. And
total debt is much higher. I've seen figures from the Federal Reserve that compared to our GDP, which is about $19.5 trillion each year, we're at about 104% total indebtedness. That's indebtedness that the government owes the government. Is that correct?
That's about right. And the debt that I mentioned, that larger number, is the long term, as we see the continuing of the retirements, we can see the continued spending relative to both Social Security, and as we see the Medicare spending. And because of lifespans and folks living longer, and as the baby boomers continue to kind of go into the retirement phase, that's where the long-term trend lines are for those programs. So that's why it's going to be going up, to which will further reduce your fiscal space, which this does a good job of explaining.
Right. And this chart here, it just illustrates where we're at again, and what our options are. If we look here to the left.
Oh, you even said mandatory, I see. There you go.
You like that? Okay. Well, really, let's begin with this. Federal spending can be divided into basically three categories. There's interest on the debt, which we all understand, unfortunately. There is discretionary spending, which is, let's keep the government running. Let's fund the national parks, pave the roads, pay the courts.
Believe it or not, the Pentagon's part of that too.
There you go. Yeah. And then also we support our military out of the discretionary budget. The mandatory budget is what you're referring to as well. And what the mandatory budget is there's no set number. There's no cap on a mandatory spending. Mandatory spending, as you say, is Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and some welfare programs. And that is just merely qualifying for that. So if you qualify, if I reach a certain age, I can apply for and receive Social Security. There is no cap on that. Now, back in 1970, Back in 1970, our discretionary budget comprised 62% of our spending. So we had a discretionary amount of money that we can apply to different priorities, where 31% of the spending was mandatory. We've reversed this ratio. And this is probably more now, between the interest and the mandatory spending, we're probably running at about 71, 72% of our dollars are committed. And we have no discretion. It's mandatory spending. We got to pay our interest. We've got to pay these mandatory payments. So we're down to about 31% of money that's available for discretionary spending, and the military consumes between about 15 and 18% of that. So we have a very small amount of flexibility to meet, a crisis, say, for instance, with automated economy and helping people find new jobs and adapt.
And actually painted a little slightly even dire. I see your 2047 number here that they have, where you see 21%. So we're more than tripling the interest on the debt. So that's interest, obviously, that you're paying on stuff that you've already spent. I'm not so sure that that's actually not a small number. I don't know what the assumptions were when they built that in. Right. But the interesting thing is the cost of interest and how much you have to pay on that can radically change depending on the economic circumstances. So if there's a downturn or people stop believing in America, see people stop buying your debt, for example, on the open market, you may have to pay a higher interest rate for people to buy it, so you can spend more than you bring in taxes, which means that that would increase the amount of money that you're having to spend in just the interest. So that could be conservative depending on the explosion of debt. So it actually could be worse than that. So if you're thinking about it, that discretionary money, which is really everything you mostly think about as government spending, for the most part, could be even smaller. So how do you deal with the issues that we're talking about with the dislocation of such a substantial population?
And I would point out that the 6% for the interest 6% of the budget consumed by our interest payments is a historical low in recent history.
Because we have really low interest rates right now. The interest we have to pay on debt is extremely low. Mm-hmm. We would be already in, and even up the creek even worse, if we had anything remotely, I think even about average interest rates.
Yeah. So in reviewing the literature on this and proposals that people have come up with, I would divide it into two different camps, a big government camp and a small government camp, or private industry. Some of the ideas about how to address these wage dislocations or job dislocations and wage decreases involve increasing the minimum wage. Increasing the cost of labor, though, would hasten the adoption of automation and automation technology, because you drive the price of labor up, technology necessarily becomes cheaper. This really isn't a great proposal. They've also talked about increased spending on an expansion of unemployment and Medicaid. I mean, that would be fine, except as I've illustrated in the previous charts, we really don't have a lot of discretion in the amount of money that we have available, for instance, augmenting unemployment programs. Another policy that they've been talking about is the implementation of a universal basic income. And this presupposes that individuals will not be able to find work, that they simply will not be able to make the jump learn the new skills, acquire the skills in order to participate in the new economy. And we're basically warehousing people. We're giving them a set amount of money, every man, woman, and child, giving them a basic subsistence level so that they can survive. Another option is, and it comes in a couple different guises, but this is universal basic employment. And people are encouraging the government, if folks can't find work, that the government create a project similar to the WPA in the 30s to go out and keep people employed, keep them active. And there's benefits, of course. I mean, one of the big benefits is that this is an immediate thing. It makes us feel like something is being done. But again, as we've seen, we're spending money we don't have. A lot of these programs end up creating a cycle of dependency. Time is always a factor that's working against us in addressing these dislocations because of automation, and government works at the speed of government. So these projects will take a while for implementation, and as they find out that perhaps there's an error, adaptation is going to take a while. The thing that's probably most important, I think, Greg, you're going to talk to this as well, is that if we adopt these programs, like for instance a universal basic income, we are radically redefining the role of government. Government will become a provider, and we will become recipients. And then finally, I would also like to point out that there's a record of inefficiency in the government, and since 1993, we've been talking about reforming healthcare, and how good has that worked out? So it's, my confidence level is not huge in big government programs addressing this. On the small private side, the small government side, I know this sounds really outmoded and outdated, but maybe we should stop spending money we don't have. I know that sounds really corny, but I mean, it's true. How about formulating a budget so at least we can quantify what money we've been spending and where it's going? We just pass, maybe on a quarterly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis, we pass one successive continuing resolution another, tagging on just a little bit of an increase in spending, assuming everything the federal government is doing is worthwhile funding. We do need to address entitlement spending. I would love to get every dime I'm due out of the Social Security system, okay? And I have to look to my children in order to make up that difference. I can't get my children to take the trash out. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get them to increase their tax rates by 10, 15, 20% so that I can have my full measure of what I think is due in Social Security. I would also advocate that we have a tremendous number of overseas commitments, and I think we need to evaluate that. We have a tremendous number of bases overseas. We're involved in different disputes and wars, Afghanistan, for instance. And I think we really need to evaluate our policies to decide that money is really well spent in those things. And of course, needless regulation needs to be eliminated. One of the other things, and I think this is key in terms of addressing this, and I think it's evident, is that we need to bring people along, to give them these new skills. Education, we need to make education more competitive. School choice should be implemented. There's no doubt. I think parents should be able to find the best school for their children, make those decisions according to their best interest, and it shouldn't be dictated as to where they live. Another thing, and this was legislation that was popular last year, I believe, the HERO Act?
In Congress, yeah.
In Congress, on the federal level, was the Higher Education Reform and Opportunity Act, or HERO Act. And this is an interesting one. The U.S. Department of Education certifies or accredits different institutions. You could run a business, or you could run a school or a college without accreditation from the U.S. Department of Education, but you can't participate in the federal grant or federal loan programs, right? So that's a true problem. The HERO Act would allow states to do the accreditation. And why is that important? Well, they certainly would accredit colleges and so forth, but especially in trying to get people plugged into the new economy, the automated economy, we could very specifically tailor education to fit a specific need. We could find funding for federal funding, grants and participation in the federal loan program, specialized program, apprenticeships, professional certification, perhaps even for one course. You could go through a Microsoft certification course so that you could plug in and work on a particular item of technology. We should be able to embrace trade schools. Businesses could actually operate on their own. They need workers. They actually set up a school to train workers to work in that business. Labor unions, trade associations, nonprofit groups, and even old people like myself who want to continue with lifelong learning would be able to go and plug in. Maybe if I don't have the money, I might be able to receive a grant or take out a loan in order to acquire the training that I would be able to update my skill set in order to go and participate more successfully in the economy. Another big or small government thing would be to reduce regulation and particularly encourage entrepreneurship.
Well, and there's several points on several of the things that you're raising. This one right here, I think, is something that I know from the Buckeye's perspective is the critical thing. Mm-hmm. Entrepreneurship, new businesses have historically been the net job creators. What happens with big entities is when the bad times hit, they economize. They use AI, they use automation. They do more with less so that they can continue to have profitability and increase their profits. But then when those people get displaced, historically, you've had new businesses start up. Now, sometimes those new businesses turn into big businesses. Mm-hmm. If you look at like the Fortune 500, it's pretty remarkable. You've got guys like Apple, Amazon, and things like that. I mean, some of these companies, especially at least Amazon, 25 years ago, had anybody ever heard of Amazon? Yet now they may be becoming the fourth largest bank, I heard, because they're going to start a bank in America, and that's one generation, not to mention all the other stuff they do. But it started as entrepreneurship. So it started small. So not everybody's going to be an Amazon or Microsoft or any of that stuff. But the key thing is that maybe it is a neighborhood store. Maybe it's a consulting service. Maybe it's a boutique kind of service that you're doing. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can imagine individuals doing. But you have to be able to have people being able to be innovative so that they can come up with something new, something that can meet a need that isn't being met or meet it in a new way that's an improvement, right? But every time you have these regulations, the red tape, mm-hmm. things like that, what you're doing is you're making it that much more difficult for the smaller guys to get started. So I've always said that Ohio in particular is a state that actually does not too bad for big business. We do not too bad because they can afford regulation. I mean, it might not be to their benefit to always have it, but it could also keep competitors out sometimes. Mm-hmm. That's something big businesses like to do sometimes. It also, and so the other thing is we do all kinds of tax abatements and policies like that to help out big businesses, but we're not doing that kind of stuff as much for the smaller guy. So we don't have a framework that allows people to test things without having to go and be regulated, whatever it is that they're doing. And that means that people are stuck. So as technology takes away the things that we know today, you have to have the flexibility to do the things you don't know about for tomorrow. You're never going to be able to have that kind of stuff happen if you're constantly stifling innovation and stifling innovation through regulations, whether they're well-meaning or oftentimes, quite frankly, and I've been around Columbus long enough, not regulations are said to be well-meaning. But trust me, they are very self-interested, and they're sometimes self-interested from private sector actors using government for their own ends. So we have to do something. This red tape rollback, I call it, is extremely important. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk maybe about some of the school stuff too, because I think you hit on several of the key things to get people skills, because there is a skills gap. Sometimes I think it may be over-promoted, mm-hmm. but I think it is somewhat real as well, and we do need to address that. But that word innovation and entrepreneurship, people say it all the time, but it is key. And it's going to become more key today than it even was in the past, because you're not going to be able to just do what your dad or your grandfather or your dad did, or maybe what you were doing 5 years ago.
And the other thing too, particularly with small business, it's nimble, it's creative, and it's adaptive. And as opposed to maybe a preponderance of larger companies imposing automation to replace workers, small business, which again employs the majority of workers in the United States, small business will be more adaptive and see technology as something that aids people or helps people. Facebook is a good example. When Facebook was acquired by Google, and I believe it was the figure for the acquisition was $1.4 billion. They had less than 100 people on staff that were operating this. They developed this technology, and it's revolutionary technology. And again, I would argue that you have a group of a small entrepreneur that developed this, and that's really endemic characteristic of small business. That it's much more adaptive, and we do need to encourage that. If we're going to plug people into the economy, we need to encourage that.
And I was going to say too, I think the key thing is that encouragement. There is a mental aspect to this that's critical. And I think that this is one of the challenges, I think, that there is in this new AI world, which is you're going to have to be nimble of mind, mm-hmm. and creative, and probably have good people skills. You're going to have a bit of all those things. It used to be that if you just woke up, did your card, did your line work, that was enough, or went out and did the construction, that was enough. And that's not the case now. So you have to be able to think it through. And so the education piece is important for being able to allow people to have creativity and having the background to understand technical aspects of things. Because a lot of this creativity is going to be about programming and developing those kind of things for the future, at new applications, new mechanisms of doing that. I guess I fear that innovation's become a bit of a catchphrase, and it's used all the time in politics, I know, but it's used sometimes in seminars that businesses will throw on, but it's no longer something that is nice to have. It is something that's essential to have. And I sound like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit, but to me, there's not going to be a small government solution unless we really unleash some of that creativity. Of course, there is a challenge because there are going to be people who aren't, to put it bluntly, what happens to the non-creative people?
Right. And that's a big problem.
But the key thing is that you've got to get these other folks creating the stuff so that there's the ability to soak some of these people up in something new.
So in summarizing the small government approaches, what are the benefits? Well, again, we're striving to allow for the maximum flexibility by incentivizing creativity, the free market, and entrepreneurship. We definitely need to eliminate regulations that are holding us back. And of course, it requires less financial support from the government if we're able to implement private market solutions, particularly since we are so restrained in the amount of money that we have in order to do this. In all of these solutions, and this is why it's so important, and this is why this is kind of the engaging part of this too, maybe it's a little bit early, but we're engaging in this, is that it's the statistic that 2/3 of the individuals who will be employed in the market in 2030 have already graduated from school. So it's important right now for the primary and secondary school, those enrolled in primary and secondary schools to be involved in these programs. But again, it's the encouragement of going out and acquiring new skills and making that opportunity available, either through private business or allowing different alternatives to open up and allowing funding alternatives for that, for people to go back to school and acquire these skills before they are indeed displaced. So in conclusion, if you recall, a long time ago, I started this and I was talking about how this all came about when I started looking at just the one factor about immigration. As I hopefully demonstrated tonight, in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see unprecedented job displacement. And we're talking about folks who are low skilled, who will generally receiving lower pay, have a lower skill set and training, and will, because of displacement, unless we do something, but I think even by and large, because of job displacement, we're still talking about an increased demand on social services. With amnesty and chain migration, I'm not against immigration by any means, but I think we have to be realistic about not the fact that how many people we want to come in, because it's a great country and a lot of people should be able to share in this, but it's how many people that we can actually afford. How can we incorporate those folks along with our own needs? And again, in 10 to 20 years, if we do nothing about chain migration primarily, we're also talking about unprecedented immigration with low skill, low paid people, folks who by and large don't have a significantly high education level, may have language and cultural barriers, and who also will place the increased demand on our social services. And we have to balance out all these needs. So, oops, went too far, pardon me. So what we need to do? Well, we have the immigration policy debate that we need to consider along with this automation revolution that we're undergoing. We need to examine our current needs and our national defense budget and expenditures. We really need, and really again, this is the engagement part, we need really to get our elected officials to consider what the future needs in our economy will be, how that'll change, and what we need to do to get Americans plugged into this. And again, I want to reiterate, I know this sounds very doom, there's a lot of doom and gloom here, millions of people, tens of millions of people unemployed, but we can't see, and I think you're going to talk about this as well, it's very difficult to look into the future. I was telling my children the other day, in the 1980s, I acquired a flip phone, and I thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world. I had no conception, other than making telephone calls, it was fantastic. And now we exist in the world where I can get on my phone, I can buy goods, it tell me where I need to go, It's kind of helping my wife out. The phone will help me to get along to where I need to be and in time and so forth. And these are all apps and developments and software that were unimagined 20 years ago. And I'm certain that this is going to be the case in the future. But if there's one takeaway from the talk tonight, it's the fact that there are significant challenges in the short and intermediate term. And we want all of these folks in this country to take advantages of these tremendous technologies that are and jobs that are in the future we can't see. And we just need to be able to be cognizant of the time that we have remaining to us in order to make the jump and conserve the resources and spend them wisely in order to help Americans acquire the skills to make that jump and that transition to the new economy. And that's about it. I do have a website here that's referenced. There's a paper there, and there's also an awful lot of resources that I've listed that are of interest and concern this topic primarily.
And I think, we're a free market think tank, the Buckeye. Is the reason that I was really impressed. I came to a meeting last month and, did a great job of putting everything out here. I think this is a good presentation because I think it does contextualize the radical transformations that are happening now. And I think that I like the Plutarch quote because I think back to the agriculture to the Industrial Revolution, the shift from agriculture there, which was mentioned, there was a wrenching transition. If you think about the trusts that were built, if you think about what Teddy Roosevelt did, if you think about, the jungle of Upton Sinclair, and you think about all the things that happened, and you think about the rise of socialists and the Communist Party and things like that, where there was actually a lot of traction. I mentioned Marx earlier, and the reason I mentioned Marx is because one of the things that I fear is going to be a political challenge for us is to fight back on the Marxist critique. We think because we won the Cold War that, we dispensed with it and communism is really kind of dead. China's, they're kind of authoritarian, but they're not communist in the same way, all that. But people kind of forget that most of practically all the countries that became communist in the 20th century were led by revolutionary, elite revolutionaries who imposed a dictatorship. That's not what Marx said would happen. That's why the Soviet Union was Marxist-Leninist, with an emphasis on the Leninist, and then of course they transitioned to Stalinist, Stalin. Cuba was Castroite, Maoism in China. The reason I think that's important is Marx always said capitalism was going to create so much that the cup was going to runneth over, there'd be enough, that then the state would be able to own all of that, and eventually the state would wither away, and we wouldn't need a state because everybody's going to live in some kind of paradise. It was a very, ironically enough, it was almost a secular Christianity in a weird sense. I mean, it's what Marxism really was. It tried to dress itself up as pseudoscience, but that's kind of the underlying premise, is that there's this utopia over here, but you always had to go through capitalism. I think that's the thing we forgot, is that the people who created these countries tried to impose something. What happens, and this is the danger that I think could be a problem as we go on, as labor becomes harder and we are struggling with the issues that we have talked about here, what happens when somebody is saying all the benefits accrue to the capital, the labor is actually becoming not just like this, is becoming almost superfluous in some cases. What do you do with superfluous labor? And what happens to those people, and how mad do they get? How lack of identity that they now have because they don't have work and honor and those kind of things. What happens to these people, and how susceptible might they be once again to the messages of radicalism, just like displaced people were at the end of the 18th or the 19th century and the early 20th century? I mean, we are probably due for some pretty amazing radical stuff. And I mean, you see it all the time on college campuses. You see it in our political discourse on both sides. And this stuff is going to exacerbate those trends. And that's why it's important that we try to get everything as right as we can, because there's some real serious political and social problems that are going to happen. Now, I'm sometimes a glass half empty kind of guy, so I sound a little apocalyptic here. And on the bright side, I'll also echo, and I love the fact that you brought up the phone and stuff, because if you think about it, this phone right here is more powerful than what a king would have had. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking, Louis XIV built Versailles, wonderful, beautiful palace. They didn't have any flushing toilets or anything else, and it's It smelled really rough, but it had really nice gardens. But if you think about what we have today, we have more today than King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had in the 1600s, and then what he had then. So that really says something about what capitalism does. It says something about the creative destruction of the market, which is what's eventually led us to this point where we have all this innovation. Because actually, it's innovation that led us to AI. Mm-hmm. It's innovation that led us to technology. And the future of innovation is going to also create more. You know, there's Moore's Law. You know, the number of transistors that you can fit on a microchip is supposed to double, every couple of years?
It's every 2 years, 18 months.
Yeah. And so this is the stuff that's going to continue. That's why you can have a thing like the terabyte
teraflops with a trillion operations.
In 1996, but it took tons of space, and now you have a PlayStation less than a decade later that does even more and does it at $500. So there's the bad side, and we must be cognizant of it because that can derail a lot of good things. But we have to look at the bright side, and the bright side is that we have come through wrenching transitions before. And I think the critical thing is to continue to educate folks that have the flexibility of education. You were talking about the education system. Mm-hmm. We have a messed up school funding system in Ohio that's worth its own education or its own seminar at some point. But we need to have flexibility for students where parents are in control and they can choose how to plug their things together. Right. So you can take online courses, you can integrate things that you are interested in. You can learn maybe at a younger age than you would have learned in a previous decade what you want to do. We need to prize the creativity, and that can be done through more flexibility through education rather than the bureaucratic mechanisms that we currently have in place. Freedom is a great thing. Free markets are a great thing. We have they've created all these benefits, but we have to actually allow ourselves to really do it. The threat that we face today is the threat of stifling some of that innovation. So from the free market standpoint, there may be something in the future where you consolidate some of these welfare programs, mm-hmm. and maybe you do some kind of a limited payment to certain people who are dislocated. That could happen. In fact, that's probably likely at some point in time, I would say, given the trajectory to do stuff. But the key thing is going to be, that's not the answer. That's the Band-Aid you put on to the wound to give yourself time for the wound to heal. And so we always are advocating, how do you do the right tax policy? How do you do the right labor policy? How do you do all of these things play a role? We have to do right by little guys, not just the big companies, but the little companies, because you have no idea who the little company is that's going to be the next big thing. Creative destruction is a scary phrase. I actually don't really, I kind of like it, but I kind of don't like it. There's a famous economist who's big in libertarian circles, Joseph Schumpeter. Is he Austrian? I think he was Austrian. He's part of the Austrian school. And he coined kind of that phrase, and he talked about it. And that's kind of what the free market does. It kind of gets rid of the old and it brings in the new. The question is what do you do with the dislocated folks in the middle? But the key is you can't stop it. If you stop it, then you're going to only be keeping people and holding back, because you were talking, you may get into a position where you can go through a machine and it can identify whether you have cancer. Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems crazy today, but is it any crazier than the flip phone to the Droid or iPhone or anything else? I'm not sure that it is. We've now seen what we can do. But I urge folks to always retain, let's keep the pedal to the metal relative to making sure innovation can thrive. And then for those folks, and there will be folks who are unable to thrive in that environment, there is probably going to be, and I'm a free market think tank kind of guy, so I'm not talking, I don't want big yarn programs. I think we're going to have to cut some deals relative to how we do our programs today. We have too many different programs siloed all over, too many different departments at both the federal and state level, and even sometimes local level. You're going to have to consolidate and get a grip on some of those things. There's probably going to be something for certain folks to ameliorate some of their situation. But the key is that can't be the solution, because that is no real solution to the ultimate problem, which is getting people really, truly prepared. Because if you just give them that, what you're really doing is I think you said warehousing?
Warehousing.
You're going to warehouse them. And then, you're warehousing them. I always thought to myself, has anybody seen the movie The Matrix?
Sure, The Matrix, right? Keanu
Reeves movie where he's in the computer thing and stuff. Well, in one of the sequels, one of the guys who's helping him gets so upset. It's this computer thing, you don't realize what's reality. And reality is really kind of super cool. And but the truth is that we actually have all been enslaved by robots, and we're actually, our physical bodies are batteries. It's a really whacked out idea. But the thing that was very interesting was one of the guys actually preferred the fake reality, the fake world, to the real world. And so he actually like turned into a trader or something like that. The reason I bring that up is that you can't warehouse these people. You don't want people to be living in this false reality. And I fear that that's something that we can do. So we have to always be working to bring people out. So the key thing is innovate, 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 and let's get the heck out of the way so that we can allow that to happen, allow people to, the vast majority of people, to transition.
And what you're saying, though, is the thing that really frightens me the most, particularly about the concept of providing a universal basic income, because I don't know how you disconnect from that. Once you start that,
done it.
I mean, we have done it by and large, actually, with our extensive welfare programs. And
no, we haven't disconnected either.
No, we haven't discussed it. And you know, and that may be a very difficult decision to make. When we're supporting people on a
well, I think that's why you're going to not. It can't be. It really probably can't. It cannot be a UBI because if it's a UBI, you run into that problem. I mean, there's actually some conservative thinkers who are talking about UBI or universal basic income. Charles Murray.
Yes.
He's a very well-known guy who's written really eloquently.
Big libertarian economist.
He's actually historically been an extremely libertarian economist, and he helped come up with, I think he actually, wasn't he the one who came up with some of the bell curve idea? He and another fellow, they wrote the bell curve. He was one of the key guys who came up with the bell curve theory and stuff. So he's a good guy, but he's starting to actually play a serious, he's arguing from the right that maybe we should consider something like that. Now, in his defense, he is talking about collapsing all your existing welfare programs. Right. It's basically a cash payment. And you're getting rid of all the bureaucracy. There's not going to be government employees checking your Medicaid stuff, your food stamp cards, or any of that. They get rid of all that. And instead of spending all the money on all that, it becomes a cash payment. You have it, and you have the freedom to do as you will. And that's the extent of the government stuff. So I'll give him some credit for saying that and all, but I don't think you can do a UBI because you have the problem of disincentivizing people to ever make themselves better. But there's going to have to be a collapse of some of those programs for some interim steps and some temporary things while people are getting the skill set they need to be able to do that. And that's probably something that we need to talk about in terms of welfare reform and things. We're talking about Medicaid work requirements right now in Ohio, actually, which is probably a good thing. So I think we're opening it up for questions. What time do we have here?
It's about 8:15. Here's a question right here.
Yes.
My name is Rose, and I find this, we have to be, us who believe in liberty and free markets, we have to be aware that those that our adversaries are seeing this as a means to an end, okay? They want to get more people dependent, not working and dependent, so that they have total control over the population. And I'm so happy to see that you're looking at it from a different perspective as how will we adjust and how will we prosper with this innovation? Because we have to embrace innovation, but how do we deal with it? To help the community and the country and the world. So this is my main concern. When you told me, when you mentioned that Obama introduced, this innovation and intelligence, that man, he doesn't act or foster anything that without a hidden agenda. And the hidden agenda always is control.
Well, I think government, here's the, to be charitable, I'll actually for a moment try to be charitable to the former president by saying this. They think that through control they can ameliorate pain, and that's what they want to do. I think there's some legitimacy. I don't totally buy the notion that Obama is totally evil. I think he is was extraordinarily misguided and continues to be about what the good actually is. I think that misguided, misshapen view is really kind of the Marxist view. And that's exactly right, because the end is not freedom. But he doesn't think freedom is the important thing, though. See, that's the Marxists. Although, ironically enough, the Marxists actually think you're going to be free at the end of the day.
Right.
But what's funny about it is, now, I guess, let's talk about a radical concept. what does happen if capital literally makes all labor superfluous because we really do have robots that can literally do everything? Now that's so radical and so crazy that in theory, you could actually envision a scenario where Marx could potentially be proven right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who knows? I don't necessarily think we're ever going to get to that radical a point, but you know, if you go extrapolating out distant future, who knows for sure? But the one thing is that it's unlikely that that's really going to be the flourishing of freedom that people think it is, because then people have that identity with the creativity that they need, the innovation. And even if it's not, I'm not saying you should be identified solely by your job or anything like that, but there is a pride that comes into effect there. And if you take away all that pride, eventually that erodes the human spirit. And I think that that's the problem. And that's where, even if all of that stuff with capital managed, and there was that technical aspect of Marxism that had some relevance in the future because of it, it's missing the spiritual component. That's where it's hollow at the core, is that it tried to secularize something that's not secularizable, ultimately. Mm-hmm. And so the key thing with the free market is let that freedom ring, because that allows the spirit to flourish too.
Other questions, please.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned this came from the Obama administration.
Well, there was one report that came
Well,
out in 2016.
I guess I have two questions then. One, is the current administration tuned into this? Is it on their radar at all? And if not, perhaps we should try to do something to get it on the radar. The second one is the education community tuned into this, and are they aware of it? And if not, should we make them aware of it, or can we make them aware of it?
You know, in the survey that I've done over this, one thing I'm really surprised about is how little is actually on this. There are some very integrated or important reports, you know, the Oxford report, the Obama report that they released in 2016 actually drew on those reports and a couple others. But in terms of academicians looking at this, I found very little in literature review. Really, a lot of this is coming out of Silicon Valley. And to be honest with you, at least this is my impression, I mean, they're scared because they understand, I think what you had just mentioned, this aggregation of wealth in one very small sector of society. The literature, there's a couple books by a fellow named Andrew McCarthy, and they talk about, they've labeled these people superstars. And they will have, because again, they visualize that all of this wealth, all of this productivity, profit will go to the folks who own the machinery, means of production, to kind of wander into Marx's law. But they're very concerned. And some of them are so concerned that they want to start giving things back. And the universal basic income, I think, is one of those ideas that they feel, well, we've got to stop something. We've got to stop this because the masses are coming. But really, and that's really why I felt so compelled to bring this to you all tonight, to engage you in this. We really do need to be encouraging our educators to look at this, and entrepreneurs and businessmen and so forth, and the current administration, which, as far as I can find, there's very little, if anything, that the Trump administration has talked about on this issue.
They haven't talked about some of the AI and the automation. I will say, to their, in my opinion, great credit, they have done a lot of some of the red tape and trying to move back on some of the regulations. And I think that's a critical piece. I don't know that they necessarily see it in this particular context, but they're going after things like licensing, for example. There's tons of occupational licenses throughout the state. Some of these are really silly. I mean, maybe a doctor should be licensed since they are doing invasive, physically invasive stuff. Maybe an engineer who builds something that if it collapses could kill people. There's things that probably it's useful, and it is truly a public safety issue. But, you know, cosmetologists and barbers and things like that, which are all licensed here in Ohio, and have to take, in my opinion, obscene numbers of hours to get there. Well, rolling these things back, letting people be able to get employed faster. Some of those jobs, they may not be high paying jobs, but those are some of those personal skill set jobs. Now, maybe someday you'll go to a barbershop and it'll be a robot barber. I mean, it's possible. I mean, I can't say it won't happen, but I think that those are going to be some of the last things that these trends go to, because there is still, I think, that desire for some human connection and things like that. And there's things, I mean, we were talking, I think, earlier too, about how do you do plumbing? How do we get in there? They've also, the Trump administration, to their credit, talked a lot about apprenticeships, which means that companies are able to start bringing people in and helping to train prospective workers with what that company needs. It's something that used to actually happen a lot, and then we kind of did traditional public education, and it became where public education became sort of the training ground for everybody. Well, it kind of worked in the industrial era because you only had to learn a base level of skills to be, quite frankly, competent to do what you needed to do on the lines, and to do that, and you could do very well. Well, now public education is kind of breaking down that area, not being as innovative. So businesses now can look for that. I mean, if you said Microsoft certification, I think you have one of your slides.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's a company that's certifying people. Then you go and you take the online stuff. You may pay a fee to do it, but you're not paying for a 4-year degree. You get a certification that says that you're competent in some kind of coding, and people look at that and they say, I need these kind of coders. I got a certification, or I did it. Those are the kind of things that we need more of. And I think the Trump administration, I've talked to some people in the administration, and they are aware of the importance of that, and also vocational school. So how do you get people into some skill? You know, are we going to have robot plumbers and robot electricians? Maybe someday. Can't say it won't happen. But again, it's going to probably be later down the road. Let's get some people into these jobs that actually we've been poo-pooing.
Question.
Not us, but some of us have been poo-pooing because it's good paying jobs.
In the last few minutes, I'd love for anybody out in the audience to kind of look in the crystal ball 10 to 20 years from now and tell me if what you see is what we heard tonight, or what do you see? Or do any of you have questions? Who's willing to look in the crystal ball and tell us what things look like? Okay, good. Let's give a round of applause for being willing to.
I'll be dead, Dave.
He'll be dead. So okay, who is
hopeful.
Anybody willing to do that? Okay, good.
I'm Jane, and I have a very highly skilled job. I'm a physician, and I feel that someday you'll walk into a phone booth, okay, type in your things, and they'll take your blood pressure, they'll draw your blood, they'll inject treatment right into you. No doctor's going to be lying and making up stories and, making things look true. And, it'll be kind of like what was that show with the vendor on that?
Where you just walk in and
you just walk in, and he would go into a suicide booth, and that would happen. Was it the robot suicide booth? So something like that.
Anybody else? I know Rose already. Anybody other than Rose who hasn't had a chance to say anything yet? Okay.
One thing before I'd like to interject too, and this kind of goes along with your previous question about is anyone from the administration looking at this? And what I have found actually, this is really highly generational. Your outlook on this. I've talked to a lot of my friends, and I talk about autonomous cars, and they say I'm nuts. I had one friend who asked me what I was doing tonight, and he said, "Well, I'm going to go talk about robots." And he said, "Well, don't waste your time. And what are you doing?" And he's an older fellow who he feels that this just isn't possible. But I have a couple of younger friends, much younger, in their 20s, and I've talked about this topic, and I'm getting, oh yeah, absolutely. This is, in fact, they've read a lot of the literature. We talked about Charles Murray, for instance, talking about. They're much more accepting about the need for this. So, okay.
Well, I foresee if the other side wins, there's going to be a new nobility. So they're not worried about their children because they'll be part of the nobility that'll be in charge of the rest of us. But I see hope. On the other side, I see hope in folks like you guys that are really thinking about the problem and are trying to adjust to get the free market ideas to adjust to the new technology.
I think the key thing here is, I think actually, as pessimistic as I can sometimes be, I think that there's, again, if you had asked people during the early days of the Industrial Revolution how the world was going, they'd say it was all going to hell in a handbasket. Kids were, getting their arms, chopped off in industrial accidents on a regular basis. People were dying in coal mines trying to get the energy out that was going to be used. I mean, there were some rough things going on during that. And you could easily have seen how that, people were saying, again, the Luddites were saying the same thing that some people are saying today. And I do think the pace of technology change today is faster, which changes it some. But I think that there's an optimistic future. The problem actually is the midterm, and I think you made that case as well. It's this gap between today and tomorrow, and it's the political implications and what happens. Because if this place today marry up with people who have some of the ideas that you were talking about, that's where you can see a lot of problems emerge over time. And that's the danger. And that's why I think we have to be sensitive to the dislocated folks, but we have to always be aggressive on the innovation side.
Here's one more question.
Michael, I certainly agree. I see it all the time. There's increased automation. There's one aspect, though, that I want to bring out is that computing chips, the actual electronics, are not made in this country for the most part. They're made overseas in China and other places in Southeast Asia. And this is actually, for the military, a huge concern because they need these. But how do they know that what they're getting is really going to work for them when they need it? I see some of the same sort of thing kind of worries me with more and more automation. How will we know that these robots will actually work the way we want them to work all the time and will not be subject to be taken over by somebody else or some other country when that won't be hacked? But I mean, it could be designed that way. And that's what I'm saying, not just hacked, but they will be designed so that they can be hacked.
You have hit upon a real subject of mine. I'm going to take my Buckeye Institute hat off for a second because I love what I do there. I do some geopolitical work on the side occasionally, and I've written for some foreign policy journals. And so one of my pet hobbies is Russia, China, geopolitics, nuclear war, things like that. So that's what I do for fun, actually. So I'm a very odd guy. And you hit on something. There's actually some big debates about Broadcom and Qualcomm right now, the microchip stuff in Singapore. I think it's Broadcom looking to buy Qualcomm, right? Because Qualcomm works a lot with the military, actually, on some of those things. And even though Broadcom's Singapore, there's concern that they could be influenced by China. And China is using that kind of stuff a lot. So, I mean, China's quite frankly, Russia, we're worried about the hacking and some aspects of Russia, and nuclear missiles and things, which is real, actually. But China is the challenge. China's the big threat and the fear that I think everybody has on this stuff. And I think, and this is why I took my Buckeye hat off, I do think that we are going to have to consider how do we have a domestic industry for that up to some point. I'm generally a believer in free markets, but this is one of the challenges you run into is free markets in a world where there isn't competition, in a world, and what I mean by competition isn't like business competition. I mean a world of like political, ideological, that kind of stuff. Eventually, maybe we're all going to decide we all want to do the same thing, but I'm not so sure I think China's proven, quite frankly, that that's not what they want. I think China has a 2,000-year-old civilization that's authoritarian and has been long before there was ever a communist party around. They had emperors for thousands of years. What makes us think they're going to change, right? So this is a philosophical difference between a very powerful country, and they are, and us. We're going to have to probably create a domestic base. And actually the Trump administration, this is one thing I think he's doing that's very smart, is looking at what are our strategic vulnerabilities and looking at how do you lock up rare earths materials to build ships? How do you deal with things? They're clearly going to go after Chinese investment in the United States. They've telegraphed that. And in a strictly free market sense, those are not free market things. But in a world where you can't trust the other guy to work in a free market, I think you're going to have to look at some of those things to address some of those concerns. That's probably worth its own conversation and presentation, but it's a dangerous issue, and I
see a future Empower You class in the making. We can talk about steel, aluminum, computer chips, and all that fun stuff. You know what? This has been one of the most interesting classes we've had because you just look in the future and you wonder if 10 to 20 years it's going to look like that, or if something that we don't even have any idea in the world is going to pop up that creates all sorts of jobs to hopefully take care of people. So let's thank our two guests, Joe Platt and Greg Lawson from the Buckeye Institute, for a great class. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg. We appreciate you coming. And we will look forward to hopefully seeing you next Thursday night at Empower You, and have a good night, everybody.